Joining us now is Frank Zaccanelli.
Frank Zaccanelli.
Let's welcome Frank Zaccanelli.
Live from the Real News Studios in Dallas, Texas, welcome to the To Be Frank Show. Your host, Frank Zaccanelli, has been in the world of domestic and international business and professional sports for 40 years. And as a former minority owner, president, and general manager of the Dallas Mavericks, he's been asked to comment on current events in the national news for most of his professional career. But what he and many others are really looking for is a place to find just the facts. Welcome to the To Be Frank Show.
Welcome to the To Be Frank Show on a beautiful Monday here live in Dallas, Texas. I'm your host, Frank Zaccanelli, and I'm happy to be here with you guys today. This is our fourth show in the podcast series that we're in the middle of shooting on a bunch of different topics. Today's topic, which is gigantically important to the whole country, is the Black Lives Matter movement. All the pieces of the Black Lives Matter movement. We have a bunch of clips that we want to play, and we're going to be talking about those clips. First, what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover a couple of current events that occurred over the weekend that I think are really important as kind of the news segment. And then I'm going to tell a story, a personal story about my business career that's going to tie directly into today's show. So let's talk a little bit about the news this weekend. First off, there is a coronavirus pandemic that is out there in the United States that is raging. There's no debate about that. There should be no argument about that. It is what it is. It's raging out there. Over the weekend, we exceeded 50,000 new cases a day. And from the looks of things on the 4th of July, from my spot here in Dallas, Texas, over the television and over the internet, it's become very, very clear to me that Tony Fauci's prediction of 100,000 cases could be possible. I mean, I saw people gathered everywhere. There was no social distancing at all. There was very infrequent use of masks. And we're in a situation to where, quite frankly, the spread of this terrible pandemic is not going to stop with the undisciplinedness of the American public. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I mean, our society and our people seem to be the most undisciplined people on the planet Earth right now, that they can't seem to get it in their heads that if you're going to really stop this and stop the vulnerable from not only getting this pandemic or getting this disease, in the middle of the pandemic, but more importantly, stopping its spread, we can't continue to live like we do. There's a lot of selfishness that's out there, and it's very, very sad to watch, because just think about the young people that have just had new babies. Think about that aspect of it. If you have a hard time thinking about grandma, think about, young people that are having children through this pandemic and the risk that is there for their young infants and the mothers. I mean, if you can't think about this on a grand scale, think about it on individual bases. But this has certainly got to stop. And unfortunately, I think that Fauci's prediction may come true. So we're going to follow this every show. The next couple of shows, as I mentioned, today's show is going to be about Black Lives Matter, the movement, and some of the history. Thursday's show is going to be the same. But we're going to continue to add in kind of these news pieces on the coronavirus. Also this weekend, we had a terrible situation developing in Hong Kong. As all of you know, China basically is in a situation to where in Hong Kong, they have violated the treaty that transferred the land of Hong Kong, if you will, over to the Chinese from the British in 1998. That treaty was supposed to last for 50 years, and the name of the treaty was two countries, or one country, two systems. And when you think about that, the freedom that was to be allowed to the people of Hong Kong that experienced that freedom throughout the whole time that the British controlled Hong Kong is now slowly but surely getting eroded away by the Chinese Communist government and their plan to suppress the people of Hong Kong. And when we talk about human rights, you certainly have to mention the fact that this is the case in Hong Kong. So we're going to be following that story as it develops. But it certainly is a situation that is not going to bode well for the people of Hong Kong based on the treaty. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened around the country that's going to tie directly into the Black Lives Movement, but what's gone on in the country this weekend. In Chicago, there were 77, now I want to repeat that number, 77 shooting instances. There were 40 people shot, and there were 14 deaths. I mean, this has got to stop. Now, Black Lives Matter matters, and we should say it, and we should believe it. But it also has to matter for the poor people that are in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, that are having to endure this incredible situation. And as we start talking about this, we can't leave aside the internal issues that have been there. Now again, whether you were a Barack Obama fan, whether you disliked him, whether you're a Donald Trump fan, or whether you dislike him, this show takes no positions on politics. That is going to be the benchmark for what I'm going to try to do on the show. We're going to be about the facts. But no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, these numbers are unacceptable. And somebody has to do something about it. Because George Floyd will have died in vain if these types of numbers are allowed to continue. These are just astronomical deaths and astronomical shootings, and it just is uncalled for. And as part of this show, I want to make it a charter piece that every show we at least mention the people of Chicago and the victims of these crimes, because they're not talked about anywhere near enough, and we've got to do something about it. Now, in New York City, Mayor Billy de Blasio, Billy D, he resided over 44 shootings and 12 deaths. Mayor de Blasio presided this weekend over 44 shootings and 12 deaths. Okay? Now, this is the same guy that last week decided that he was going to take $1 billion away from the police budgets. Same guy. He decides that, well, okay, we don't need as much policing, and we don't need this, and we don't need that. 44 shootings, 12 deaths in New York City. And it's an embarrassment. And it's an embarrassment for the people that live there, and I'll tell you what's going to happen. You can mark this down. Businesses and people are going to be moving out of New York City. They're not going to tolerate this, because you shouldn't be able to tolerate it. At the time when we should be peacefully protesting, okay? Again, I say this every show. Peaceful protests are a part of our society. They're a part of our Constitution, the First Amendment, all the pieces to it. But when those protests turn into violence, and then they turn into looting, and then they turn into innocent people being shot, it can't be tolerated. So Billy de Blasio is presiding right now, and in my opinion, responsible for the demise of one of the greatest cities on the planet. And then we have the situation in Atlanta. This weekend, an 8-year-old girl driving in a car was shot and killed. And one of my favorite people, and I've not met her, but I want to have her on the show, Mayor Bottoms gave another, what I consider to be emotional, beautiful speech about this just needs to stop. I think her leadership is balanced on both sides. She is calling for reform, but she's calling for it in the right way. And I'm a big fan of Mayor Bottoms. So the Atlanta situation, it's uncalled for. It's got to stop. All of this has got to stop. And that's what I think that we're all striving for. Because, again, George Floyd and all of the innocent African Americans that have been killed by police, their memory is going to be tarnished unless we can fix this. So that's what we're going to attempt to talk about, and we're going to start with that today. So let me start off the show really with a personal story. And it's a personal story about my business career. About 17 years ago, I was introduced to 2 young African American entrepreneurs. And I met these guys, really nice guys, and they were in the telecommunications business. So I said to them, I said, so what are your goals? And they said, well, we'd like to, work on getting government contracts. And I said, okay, so what are you doing about that? Well, we don't have the people to really, because we don't have the money, but we don't have the people to really get in the middle of the government contracting business. But we really think that we could do a really good job, especially on the technology side. And our specialty on the technology side is satellite construction and operation. And I said, well, let me look into this and let me do some homework and let me see what is out there. So I called up a couple of my friends in Washington and I got the lay of the land. And what ended up happening is that we were able to apply and to get granted the certification for the 8A government contracting minority business designation. And what that really means is that as a minority company, you're now qualified to go arm in arm with some of the bigger companies in the government contracting business with both the State Department and the Defense Department. And your ability to be able to bid with them is now designated so that, in fact, your involvement with those big companies helps them win the contracts, and then you get a portion of the contract for doing all that, provided, again, that you can do the work. And these guys could do the work. So the names of the businesses are unimportant here, but the story is gigantically important because these guys, with a little bit of help from me, took a company from 4 employees and $60,000 a year in gross revenue, enough to keep the lights on, to 175 employees and $50 million a year in gross revenue. It's unbelievable. They're one of the fastest growing 8A minority-owned, African-American-owned businesses in the United States. And one of the partners, who was really the founding partner and the guy that really put this together, literally trained himself and spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, because part of the job now of this company was to build satellite networks for the non-military forces that were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. Interestingly, when you really take a look at it, this was some of the most dangerous stuff that anyone's ever done. But the people that were hired by the non-military companies all had some form of military or police training with automatic weapons. And they went into theater, if you will, and built these satellite networks. This company did a phenomenal job by all indications, by the primary contractor to the State Department. They did a phenomenal job. And the company built itself up. And actually, I was very proud. It looked like the company that it was supposed to be, because of the 175 employees, African-American company, about 75% to 80% of those employees were African-American. So it was a tremendous program all the way around. And they built this company, and I was involved. And the ownership of the company and the management of the company at the time that the contracts were let were in full support. What happens is the company sold. About 2 years in, the company ends up selling. And a hedge fund guy comes in, not to mention his name, but he was not a good guy. And he comes in and he gets rid of all the management who set these programs up. And you got to remember, if this company was doing the kind of numbers that I tell you they were doing, and the growth was there and everything was working very well, think about the primary contractor. They were getting billions and billions of dollars. But this hedge fund guy thought he was smarter than everybody else. And he went in and he decided one day that was enough. And he started stealing employees from the company until the company was forced to shut down. All of it illegal. Now, I sat in meetings as an independent business guy. And a lot of the people that were in the bowels of this primary contractor company, not the management, but people in the bowels, didn't really know I was associated with the company. And some of the things that I heard were unbelievable. It was the N-word on steroids. And the reason I say it was the N-word on steroids is curse words packaged the N-word. It was terrible. So I had had enough of that after the first meeting. And I pulled two of these gentlemen aside and explained to them that I was also part of this company and that their conduct was not appreciated, and that I was going to go to the management and let the management know that this is how they felt. It was all boiled down to the African Americans were making too much money. Now, fast forward. All the employees get stolen. All of this happened. The company then files a federal lawsuit and wins the federal lawsuit for not as much money as what it cost them, but they were awarded $20 million. And what happens is it went on appeal and half of the award was taken away. But a $50 million vibrant company was stolen. I was a partner, a minority partner with the African American entrepreneurs. And I saw it and I lived it. And if people are out there and they don't think that racism exists in today's world, you need to think again. I lived it, I saw it, and it's disgusting. Fast forward into today's world. You get into a situation to where, depending on your political persuasions, everybody's sitting around talking about, well, you know, this is not as bad as we think, or on the other side, this is way worse than we think. Well, I think what needs to happen is that story, that's a true story that I lived, needs to be a basis from which people can start to think about this maybe a little differently. When people of color, African Americans, when their businesses are stolen because they're doing too good and people don't like that, there's a real problem here. Now, for their part, these guys stood up, we filed federal lawsuits, and that was a 2 or 3 year process. This shouldn't surprise anybody, but no one in the government really cared. Went to the State Department, went to the Defense Department, called up everybody you could possibly imagine. But you know what? Nobody seemed to care. And that's also part of the problem that we deal with today. Now, what I want to do is off of that story, I want to talk a little bit about the history, because we've got a lot of people that are quoting the history of our country, but I don't think they're getting it right on both sides. And again, we're not taking political positions here, but I don't think that they're getting it right. And let me tell you a little bit about what that means. You've heard so many people in the last week or two because of the 4th of July. You've heard people talk about the Declaration of Independence, signed and ratified, if you will, July 4th, 1776. It's very important, 1776. And let me read this to you. You've all heard it, and you got politicians that are reciting it, but I want to tell you what it actually really means. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we've all heard this. Everybody's talking about this. The politicians love to give that speech, and boy, oh boy, it's the greatest. Well, let's talk about what that really meant in 1776. The United States of America, literally a ragtag army, fought off the British and basically became the United States of America, where the 13 colonies started this whole thing. And when you really look at this thing, it was a wonderful time in our country, the start of our independence, not under British rule, but it wasn't great for everybody, because in bondage, in slavery, by 1800, there were almost 1 million slaves that didn't have their freedoms. So when you talk about endowed by their Creator, all men are created equal, all men except for the slaves. And so that was a scourge on everything that I believe that our country was really trying to do. And what you're going to find out from me is I'm very proud of our country in most things. As a lot of Americans, we have a lot to be proud of here. When I see people on the 4th of July that are protesting that say our country was never any good, don't listen to that. And oh, by the way, they're a bunch of white guys instead of a bunch of African Americans protesting. These people are anarchists. They don't like the country. They don't want the country to go forward. That should not be our goal. But you see these protests even over the 4th of July that our country's never been any good. It's not true. Our country's invented everything. The airplane, the car, electricity, the internet. I mean, we can go on and on and on. We fought in 2 world wars to liberate a big part of the world. So people that say that our country is no good and has never been any good, I know that the vast majority of people, black and white, do not believe that. It's a small group that is trying to cause upheaval in our country. But when it comes to the Declaration of Independence and all men are created equal, it was not necessarily the case in 1776, leading all the way to 1800. So now we fast forward, and all of these facts are out there. You can look them up on Wikipedia, because it's a wonderful thing to actually study this, because that's what I did getting ready for this show, and it's an amazing thing about how all this comes together, because a lot of non-African Americans have not really spent the time to really think about our history, to really think about where we've come from and some of the scourges of slavery and the aftermaths. I mean, we just haven't done enough studying. And that's what I hope, again, not only this show, but ongoing shows are going to be able to give the facts so people can really take a look at this. So again, in 1800, there were about 1 million slaves. By 1850, we were almost at 4 million slaves. Almost 4 million people that were in the middle of the slavery scenario, if you will, and didn't have these freedoms, didn't have these rights. And in 1863, January 1st of 1863, and I'm going to read this, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation as the nation approached the third bloody year of the Civil War, 1863. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves and henceforth shall be free. Well, that was an important day, but it didn't necessarily, or it certainly didn't fix the problem. What Lincoln did was set in motion the inner workings now for the passage of the 13th Amendment that was passed in 1865. 1865, that by the act of Congress abolished slavery as now the law of the land. So as we take a look at this, just do the math. 1776 Declaration of Independence, 1865, the 13th Amendment, that's 89 years of a sector of our population, the African American slaves, that did not have their freedoms. They were not endowed with these freedoms. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment that was passed through Congress set in stone again the framework to try to fix this terrible problem. Now, this is where it gets really dicey. I'm not against taking down statues of people that shouldn't have statues, okay? I often wonder how people get a statue to begin with. Obviously, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson are the forefathers of our country. And they should have statues, and their statues should not be taken down. But they tore down a statue of Frederick Douglass. Now, I didn't know much about Frederick Douglass, but let me read this to you. In 1865, right around the time of the 13th Amendment, Frederick Douglass said that slavery is not abolished until the black man has a ballot. Let me repeat that. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has a ballot. Now, these people that are tearing down these statues are just tearing down statues because they're vandalizing. But Frederick Douglass really stood up for the whole movement. And when you really look at it, his words rang clear that until African Americans had the ability to vote, there really wouldn't be a lot of change in the country. So in early 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill that granted blacks the right to citizenship and the right to vote. This is 1866. Soon after, and this is an amazing thing, in the South, 22 black men were sent to Congress, 2 in the Senate, 22 total, and helped to elect Ulysses S. Grant as president in 1868. Grant led the Union, by the way, to victory in the Civil War. Now, I've watched for the last 3 weeks, taking statues of Grant down. All Grant did was fight to win the Civil War against the South and abolish slavery, and then became president. Now, some of the criticism to Grant is justified at the time because some of the men in his administration didn't have the same fervor for equal rights and equal opportunity that President Grant had. So there's some skepticism to it. But Ulysses S. Grant fought for freedom. He fought for the end of slavery, and he fought for the black man in the South to be able to vote and have a voice and live under the Declaration of Independence. So when we start tearing down Frederick Douglass statues and Ulysses S. Grant statues, people don't even know why they're tearing them down. But I think that we need to all study this and really try to understand it because it's a major part of our American history. Right around the time of Reconstruction, and this is now probably in some ways the worst of it, all these laws are passed, all of these statutes are passed, legislation, voting, all the stuff. The Jim Crow laws went into effect for about 100 years. Now, we've all heard about Jim Crow. Do we really know about who this guy was? Well, this guy was an actor. His real name was, I'll tell you his real name in a minute. His real name was Thomas D. Rice. And in 1828, he was an actor, and he did some skits about black men and about their ability to sing and dance and all this other stuff. Thomas D. Rice. That's how the whole Jim Crow, and he called it the Jim Crow show. And that's how the whole name Jim Crow, because for years and years I thought that Jim Crow was some bigoted Southerner that lived somewhere in the South that created all of this. That's not the story. But the Jim Crow laws that came right during the Reconstruction period that lasted for 100 years were local and state laws that were in complete contravention to the federal laws that were passed. And in these states and in these local communities, the Jim Crow laws did everything to take away the now African American rights of citizens of this country. And this went on for 100 years. And this was a terrible time in our country's history. And this is after the Civil War. And this is after all of the legislation. And so this was allowed to happen on a state and regional basis. And to be candid, it was some of the worst times during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction in our country's history. And there's a stinging effect to this because this did not end until Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So think about these time frames now. I mean, you're going from 1865 to 1964. You're going 100 years. And Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act had the backing, obviously, of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and all of the progressive people in the United States that wanted and, quite frankly, demanded change. But for 100 years, this was allowed to fester. It was allowed to go on in places in the United States after the Civil War. So when Johnson signs this, it becomes the most sweeping piece of legislation since 1865. And some say that it was one of the most important pieces of legislation in our current times that did away with the Jim Crow laws. Now, to be candid, I'm not sure that you're going to find African Americans that live in the South that are going to say that the Jim Crow laws ever ended. I'm sure you're going to hear story after story after story. Again, remember the story I just told 10 or 15 minutes ago about stuff that I was directly involved in. You know, I got to laugh when people on television say, you know, America is not a racist country. No, 90% of Americans, I believe, are good-hearted, responsible people. But it's the minority that continue to cause these problems, whether they're police, whether they're in Congress, whether they're in business. It's the small percentage of people that create the biggest percentage of the problems. And someone asked me, they said, you know, do people really understand the African American culture? Do non-African Americans really understand it? And I said, well, I would say no. And I would say this, that I would say since I was a kid, African Americans on television, on the news, are portrayed in the worst way possible. It's about stealing. It's about crime. It's about just irresponsibility. It's about poverty. It's about all these things that are presented to the American public and to the world on television. And when you look at the way that African Americans have been portrayed, it hasn't been fair, because it's set a mindset with a lot of people that African Americans are lazy, they don't want to work, they don't really care about their families, all these things. I'll tell you, I was in the NBA for 5 years. As some of you know, I was the minority owner, president, and general manager of the Dallas Mavericks. Do you know the question that I got asked more than any other question? Now, the NBA is 80 to 85% black. You know the question I got asked more than any other question is, well, these guys are lazy, right? And I said, lazy? I said, do you know how hard these athletes work to be one of 350 to 400 people around the planet Earth that can do what they do? Do you know how hard they work? Do you know how much time they put into it? I mean, but that was the question that I really got when I first started, more than any other question. Well, these guys don't work that hard. 95% of the NBA, from what I saw over a 5-year period, work their ass off. They work hard. And they're committed to their craft, and they're really smart, good guys. So that whole thing again about the notion of, in certain people's minds, it's completely wrong. So I thought about what needs to happen here in order to try to make this come together. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter and the movement, and we're going to show some clips, and I'm going to show you the positive, and then I'm going to show you the negative. And I'm going to talk about what I see as somebody who's really paid attention to this, about the go forwards on what needs to happen. What's clear is that if you really want to understand, if you're a non-African American and you really want to understand their culture, go to an African American church. Go attend a African American service any Sunday of the year. Here in Dallas, I'm a big fan of Reverend Tony Evans, and Tony has become now very big around the country and around the world. And he's got the Bible Church down in Oak Cliff, just south of Dallas. Tony and I met back in the Maverick days. He was the chaplain, and I was the captain, quite frankly, of the Titanic, trying to figure out how we weren't going to lose another 10 games in a row. And I spent a lot of time with Tony before the games talking about his ministry. And what he's done was his ministry and his whole situation and program If you want to really understand African American culture, go to an African American church on Sunday. Number one, the message is going to be as solid as anything you've heard. And number two, now I practice my faith through the Catholic Church, but Christians are Christians in my mind. Number two, the music's going to be 25 times better than your church. Trust me when I tell you. It'll be 25 times better. So do that for yourself. And I want to give you a statistic. According to Wikipedia, there's 240 million Christians in the United States. There's 350 million Americans. So by large numbers, Christianity is the number one religion in the United States. Now, everybody who's a historian will say that the country was founded off of Christian Judeo principles. Everyone will talk about that. But when you really take a look at these numbers, this might be the foundation for maybe where we can get started. And in the United States, according to Wikipedia, 83% of the African American population consider themselves Christians of some denomination. I think it's a pretty good place to start. And based on what I'm looking at and based how I view it, maybe God needs to be involved here in trying to clean some of this up. So if you want to talk about and you want to understand about the African American culture, don't go on television and watch some sitcom. Go to an African American church and really understand about the culture. Okay. So now for the run of show. That was the monologue. We're going to talk about, and we're going to show some clips of things that I thought were incredibly important. The first clip is going to be a clip of Coach Mike Krzyzewski. Now, for those of you that don't know who Coach K is, Coach K is by the numbers, the second most successful college basketball coach ever in college basketball history next to John Wooden. But he also has been the two-time head coach of the United States Olympic team. And he was also an assistant coach under Chuck Daly on the 1992 version, the Dream Team. So Mike Krzyzewski has got incredible understanding, if you will, of this subject. And I want to play a clip, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I want to play the clip of Coach K. So can we run that clip?
Black Lives Matter. Say it. Can't you say it? Black Lives Matter. We should be saying it every day. It's not political. This is not a political statement. It's a human rights statement. It's a fairness statement. Over the last couple months, I have had an opportunity to see more, to listen more, to think more, and to understand at a deeper level. So have you. Yeah, so have you. And do we not see the problem, the disease, the plague that has been with our country for 4 centuries? Do we not see systemic racism and social injustice? Come on. We all see that. It's manifested in so many ways. Criminal justice, the killings that we have seen and we haven't seen, and the denial of economic opportunities for our black community, educational opportunities, health care. It's manifested in so many ways and has been there for 4 centuries.
Okay. As you can clearly see, Coach K makes a passionate plea for people to do exactly what I've been talking about here for the last 25 minutes, which is to get yourself educated on the facts. Okay? He says it over and over and over. Yes, Black Lives Matter. And then you get all the people, Frank, all lives matter. Yes, all lives matter. But Black Lives Matter because of the circumstances in which the African American community has had to deal with certain things that no one else has had to deal with. And again, that's the reason that I got into this little history lesson. So Coach K is an incredible source for not only sports fans, but anybody to listen to his words and heed what he's saying about educate yourself, try to understand some of these things. What I think Coach K is really saying from a coach's perspective is that we're not going to solve this unless both sides come together. And this is a good time for me to make this statement. The government's not going to solve this. They're incapable of solving this. They can't even pass police reform, okay? They are gridlocked, and it's not going to end anytime soon. It's not going to end after the election. It's been this way for a long time. The United States government, when it comes to operations, is in gridlock. Nothing's getting done, and that's the way it's going to be. What's got to happen here is that people from the private sector have to get together. They've got to be able to figure out what are the solutions to these problems. Now, it's not going to be handled by just protesting, because protesting needs to be a form of negotiation. You've got to be able to figure out exactly what you want and how you're going to get there. But neither side is going to succeed until the country comes together and tackles this, both black and white together, to figure out how we come up with the answers and the reforms that are necessary to move this country forward. The second clip is of Black Lives Matter, and this is disturbing to me. This is the New York founder. You'll watch it. You've probably seen it, where this gentleman, who I'm not going to pick on. We're not going to do that. But this gentleman states that if we don't get what we want, we're going to burn the system down. Roll the clip.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it. All right, and I could be speaking figuratively. Okay. I could be speaking literally. It's a matter of interpretation.
Okay, you can clearly see by the clip that this would be the equivalent. I'm a real estate investor. I go in and I want to buy a building. The guy says to me, I'm not selling you the building. And I say, I'm going to burn your building down if you don't sell it to me. Given that alone, there's no way that that approach is going to be able to work. And again, I am not picking on this individual. He has the right to say what he wants to say, but what I am suggesting is that's not the route to where we're trying to go. It's not the route. And it's not going to engage both sides in a positive discussion about what needs to happen. Now, this third clip is a list. And now, these lists are out there. So, there's going to be a lot of argument with this, because Black Lives Matter, which is somewhat of a fragmented association, and I believe that that is problematic for the movement moving forward. I'd like to see there be more consensus and more central control of this. And maybe that's some of what could happen, because there are a lot of people saying a lot of different things. And a team united beats a team divided 10 out of 10. And not to say that the Black Lives movement is divided. That's not what I'm saying. But there are a lot of contradictory opinions coming out of a lot of places inside the movement. And so what I've tried to do is pick a list of what the demands are. And I've tried to meet somewhere in the middle on these demands, but what I'd like to do is have you now put the list up and let people take a look at the list. Okay? I'm not even going to read them. I think it's easy enough for people to take a look at them. I'm not going to become contradictory. But in a guy who's built businesses and run companies and been in a leadership position, at some level now, the Black Lives Matter movement has got to come together in an organized fashion where they sit down with non-Black Lives Movement people and come up with a structure of realistic demands that ultimately can change the society for the better. When we start talking about police reform and we start talking about what needs to happen, I could come up with a list of things that are just common sense that I would think that 100% of the people could get around. Number one, we got to hire police better. Got to get into their backgrounds. We got to get into their family backgrounds. We got to get into their childhood. We got to get into where the police people come from and what their ideologies are. Because we don't need people on each side of the spectrum. We need people here. It's the only way we're ever going to solve anything in this country, by the way, is we got to get people right here. But we've got to hire better. As I mentioned in a prior show, you know, corporate America has been involved with hiring psychologists that come in and test people before these big companies hire them. That might be a pretty good idea, is come up with some format to be able to figure out how police are hired. And then it's really all about training, training, training. Because when you take a look at police departments, a lot of these people that have now caused this incredible mess that we find ourselves in are repeat offenders. This is the one and done. There can't be this repeat offender thing. It's got to be one and done, because this is not something that can be tolerated over a number of different incidents. So the whole training side of everything. And then I think there's got to be monitoring. I don't know if unions are the cause of not being able to get rid of a bad cop, but if they are, that's got to be fixed, because that cannot be a reason why a police officer that shouldn't be there is still there. So those are just some commonsensical things that I think can really be implemented without a lot of controversy. What I am telling you is, and what I think anybody in the know will say, is that defunding the police around the country is the worst idea known to man. We cannot do that. What these people in Minnesota are doing, you know, it's outrageous. There's a burglar in your house and you call 911. I got a problem in my house. Can you get somebody over here? And they send a social worker over to talk you down from the fact that a burglar came into your house? I don't think so. Take a look at Billy de Blasio. He takes $1 billion out of the budget. Look at the weekend this guy had. What was he doing? Was he at the gym? Guy likes to go to the gym. Was he at the gym? Where was he? I mean, again, I'll go back. 44 people shot, 12 dead in New York. Come on. I mean, we're better than this. We can do better than this. So we've got to be able to figure these pieces out. All right, the next clip is an African-American mom. And we're going to roll the tape. And if this doesn't get to you, nothing will.
Hey guys, no intro today because the message is just too important, so I just want to jump into it and speak from my heart. This is going to be a rather raw video in comparison to the typical video that I put out, but it's really, really important. Clearly, most of us at this point, even if you are living in a different country, understand what is taking place in the United States, and it is heartbreaking. I have had so many intense emotions over the past week, and I have been drained to a point that I couldn't understand. And I know that there's a collective energy that is draining a lot of us emotionally. I went on Facebook Live several days ago to just share my heart and my thoughts around how a person could take somebody's life so effortlessly, so carelessly, without understanding or caring about the repercussions and the ripple effect that could possibly take place because of that officer's one action.
Okay, again, the clip is self-explanatory. You look at the situation and the moms, let's go back to Mayor Bottoms in Atlanta. 8-year-old little girl in the car with her mother gets shot and killed. All right? Our children are not safe, and we've got to make it safe. And I think that a big, broad spectrum of this, when you really take a look at it, and something that I think can bring more people together to the organized, I hope, Black Lives Matter movement, is its effect on children. The deaths in New York, the death of that beautiful little girl in Atlanta, and the deaths in Chicago have got to be added to the long list of what's got to be fixed. I think when that is brought into focus, if you will, I think the movement can take a major leap forward with a lot of non-African Americans on board, because people are sick and tired of seeing this. They feel for these communities. They feel for the children. But without any of this, we're just going to spin in the wind. If Black Lives Matter demands a list of the demands that we just showed, and if we don't get these demands, we're going to burn the system down, based on that, the movement's not going anywhere. I'm sorry, and that would be the worst tragedy of all, because then George Floyd and the rest of these African Americans that were unjustly killed are going to die in vain. You cannot, as a country, let that happen. And then we go to the fifth clip. This is a beauty. We actually have fifth and sixth. So this one's a beauty. This is a beauty. So I'm watching the TV when this is occurring, literally trying to make myself believe that it was actually happening real time. The mayor of Seattle, the Summer of Love clip. Roll the tape.
I think it shows a complete lack of understanding of why people are in the street. They're in the street fighting a system of domination, and he doesn't understand that. And his response is always one that's bellicose and militaristic, but he doesn't honor the military in that way either, as you've seen from the line of generals that have disputed him. So I think he says dominate because he totally does not understand what is happening in America, and he is desperately trying to start the old fights and the old divisions that put him in power in the first place.
How long do you think Seattle in those few blocks looks like this?
I don't know. We could have the Summer of Love.
I mean, do I say anything else here? I mean, are we nuts? And then they build the CHOP, okay? And she allows for all that to happen. Cops are not allowed into the CHOP. Then all of a sudden, innocent people are being shot inside the CHOP. So now her Summer of Love has turned into one of the biggest embarrassments of any mayor in the history of the United States. I'll tell you this, everybody's focused on the national election, okay? The presidential election, and then what's going to happen in the Senate and in Congress. And everyone's focused on it. And this November, you're going to be able to exercise your constitutional right and go vote. But let me tell you something. These mayors and the cities and the council, and I'm not taking sides, Democrat or Republican. All the Republicans want to say is, well, all this stuff happens in only Democratic related scenarios where the mayors are Democratic. In some cases, that's true. But in other cases, take a look at this coronavirus. This thing's blowing up all over the South with Republican mayors and governors. So, there's enough blame to go around. But the fact of the matter is, this nut job in Seattle cannot be the focus of what we're trying to do to solve these problems, because we're going to solve nothing. The summer of love, I don't think so. And our last clip today is disturbing to me based on what I spoke about African American culture, about churches, about the answer maybe to get this dialogue going between the churches, black and white. This is the founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, Shaun King. Roll the tape.
Activist Shaun King is calling for the destruction of artwork depicting Jesus as a white man. Monday, King denounced these depictions as, quote, a form of white supremacy. He argues historically Jesus Christ was likely not a white man, and artwork showing him as one is racial propaganda.
Now, this one's personally offensive to me. As a Christian, it's personally offensive. And if I'm right, which I think I'm right, that the answer to the dialogue and having meaningful dialogue may come between African Americans and non-African Americans through the churches, through dialogue that ultimately makes real change, Shaun King should be ashamed of himself, because what he's done is basically offend 240 million people in the United States, 240 million Christians in the United States. Jesus Christ has nothing to do with this other than the fact that it certainly was not a cult. And he, according to every Christian, including myself, was the Son of God. So I think that anybody who wants to start picking on Jesus Christ probably should find another avenue, because you're not going to get very far. So those are the clips, and those are the those are the issues that I think that I really wanted to have on this show. As kind of a closing to all of this, I think that we have to all look into our own hearts and our own souls and our own minds, and we've got to again understand that a country divided as this country is, and again, on one side of the equation, you've got one party saying it's their fault. And you want to know what? They're right. And on the other side, you got the other party. And they're sitting around pointing fingers to the other side. And they're blaming everyone on that side. And guess what? They're right. But under the theory, the Buffalo Springfield's song, nobody's right if everybody's wrong. And that's what's going on now in this country. And if we think we can solve the problems that are facing us in 2020 with the onslaught of the coronavirus pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement that is occurring not only all across the country, but all across the world, we're not going to get there unless we can have logical, sustained dialogue between the parties to be able to figure out how we get to real meaningful change. Blaming the other side doesn't get us where we need to go. It just doesn't get us there. All it does is make the problems wider, deeper, and longer. It doesn't solve anything. So I believe that the non-political side of the United States of America, led by leaders in the community of all walks of life, races, creed, colors, come together and try to figure out how we move the ball forward on real change and real reform. Without it, we're just not going to get there. So I'm very happy to do this show and attack this incredibly important problem that we have. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at Facebook, the 2B Frank Show Facebook. You can reach us at the 2B Frank Show YouTube. You can reach us at the 2B Frank Show Twitter. And you could reach us at the 2B Frank Show LinkedIn. Those are the 4 right now carriers of this show, and we'd like to hear from you. We are really excited about the show, and on Thursday, we're going to have a guest or 2 on the show that we're going to talk more about the Black Lives Movement situation, and we're going to have a bunch of new information for you about other aspects of this. So it's great to be with you today. I'm your host, Frank Zaccanelli, signing off on Monday's show. God bless everybody and stay safe.